Saturday morning in Messina, and the strait between Sicily and the mainland fills with boats, the way it has for 8 centuries. The fish market under the arcades is loud before 8, crates of swordfish and sardines, families haggling in a dialect that hasn't drifted far. A cathedral chapter nearby has kept unbroken records, baptisms, burials, guild rolls, running straight through the 12 and 1300s, no mysterious missing decade. A guide points tourists toward an old quarantine house on the point, the Lazzaretto, and calls it, almost as a throwaway line, the building where we got lucky. Nobody in the market is thinking about ships that never came. They're thinking about the price of swordfish. Here's what should stop you. An unbroken parish register running straight through the 1200s shouldn't exist in any Sicilian port city. In the history you know, those registers go silent for stretches in the mid-1300s. Not from bad record-keeping, but because there's often nobody left alive in the parish to write in them. Rewind to October 1347. Along the Black Sea coast, a Mongol army has spent months besieging Genoese merchants inside a fortress called Kaffa in Crimea. And by one contemporary account, catapults plague-ridden corpses over the walls to spread the disease inside. However it started, the Genoese ships that eventually flee Kaffa carry something with them: black rats and infected fleas, carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Those ships make port at Messina. By the time anyone understands what's aboard, sailors are already dying on the docks. Messina's authorities try to expel the ships once the deaths begin. It's too late. The infection is already ashore, moving with the rats, the fleas, and the people who've made contact. From Sicily, it follows the trade routes north and west: Genoa, Venice, Marseille, Paris, London, and beyond. Estimates vary, but a widely cited range puts the toll at 30 to 60% of Europe's population, tens of millions, in an era with no understanding of germs, no antibiotics, often no way to bury the dead fast enough. It remains the deadliest documented epidemic in human history. So what would it take to break that chain at the very first link, before it ever left the docks? Not a vaccine 6 centuries early, not different rats, something almost administrative. And this time, Messina's harbour authority gets there first. In this timeline, word reaches Messina a few days ahead of the fleet. A faster merchant ship carries rumours of a strange sickness tearing through the siege camp at Kaffa. The harbour master, cautious, unpopular, already known for isolating suspect cargo in ordinary years, orders the incoming Genoese ships held at anchor outside the mole. Nobody lands, no cargo comes ashore until the crews are inspected. It's an improvised, almost accidental version of what later cities will formalize as quarantine, literally 40 days, a generation before that word exists. 2 ships turn out to carry sick and dying sailors. They're kept isolated at anchor, supplies passed out by pole, until the sickness burns out in the small population trapped aboard. The rats never reach the grain stores. It's still a real tragedy for the men on those 2 ships. Most of them die at anchor, watched from shore, beyond what the medicine of 1347 can do for them. Messina buries its dead, quarantines the docks out of caution for a season, and life goes on. No second ship carries the sickness inland. No infected rat boards a cart bound for Catania, or a hold bound for Genoa. The chain that, in your history, ran for 4 years and thousands of miles, breaks at the very first link. So Europe's population doesn't fall by a third. It keeps climbing on the same slow medieval curve it was already riding. That sounds like an unambiguous win. Here's the part that should surprise you. In several important ways, it wasn't. In the world you know, losing something close to half the population in a few years created a labour shortage severe enough that surviving peasants could, for the first time in centuries, negotiate. Landlords, desperate for workers, had to offer wages, even mobility, leave one manor for a better offer down the road. Historians widely credit that shock with cracking open rigid feudal structures decades earlier than they'd otherwise have loosened. In this timeline, that pressure never arrives. Labour stays cheap, land stays scarce, and leverage never shifts to the peasant class. Feudal obligations that historically eroded by the late 1300s instead persist, weakened but recognisable into the 16th century. Which brings us to the genuinely ironic part. The Renaissance, was funded partly by concentrated wealth, fewer heirs splitting the same estates, merchant families suddenly rich relative to a shrunken population, guilds with surplus to spend on art and ideas. Remove the population collapse, and that wealth stays spread thin instead of pooling. Florence and Venice still produce brilliant painters and thinkers here, but patronage arrives slower, and the flowering historians call the Renaissance is dated a full generation later, looking less like an explosion than a long, gradual simmer. Here's the sharpest irony of all. The word quarantine, from the Venetian 40 giorni, 40 days, exists in your world because port cities, watching the Black Death return wave after wave, formalized ship isolation into law by the late 1300s. In this timeline, Messina's harbour master improvised the identical idea a generation early, and it worked so quietly that nobody codified it into standing law. So when a genuinely new epidemic, a severe influenza, moves through Europe's larger, more crowded cities in the early 1500s, ports have no quarantine statute on the books yet. Add it up today, and you get a world with meaningfully more people. Demographic historians who've modelled the counterfactual put Europe's population, and the world's, measurably higher than the one you grew up in, simply because one catastrophic dip in the 14th century never happened. More people, more cities, more of everything downstream of population. But labour rights, land reform, and social mobility, the parts of the modern world historians partly trace to the plague's aftermath, arrive later, more unevenly, fought for harder instead of handed over by a demographic accident. Which brings us back to that fish market under the arcades. The stall at the far end has belonged to one family for, depending which cousin you ask, either 19 or 21 generations, back past the ships that never landed. Old Salvo, who runs it now, keeps a laminated copy of a 15th century harbour ledger tacked to the wall, recording 2 ships held at anchor and the sailors buried outside the walls. He doesn't call it tragic. He calls it proof the city does one thing well. It doesn't panic. It waits and watches. He has no idea how literally true that is. His own unbroken family, this loud, ordinary Saturday market, all of it, traced back to a harbour master who decided, a few days early, not to let 2 ships tie up.